Hello and welcome to my workshop. So a while back I made this Jeep Willys body. Now this is a replica of the Jeep my granddaddy had when my dad was a kid. And it's based on a little pretty small chassis here. So I'm going to be making another Jeep Willys body, but it's going to be a little bit bigger. And this is going to go onto an RC four-wheel drive chassis. Alright, so let's get started. To start off the build of the Jeep Willys, I glued together some MDF blocks. These were made thick enough to match the drawings. The rear is pretty simple with just rounded corners. I get questions about where I find these drawings, and the answer is it varies. However, it's mostly doing Google image searches with keywords like drawing, sketch, blueprint, etc. The MDF is taken to my benchtop sander to quickly get it into shape. With the rear section complete, I moved to the side panels. With the flat panels of the Jeep, it's mostly just marking off where the body dips around the wheel wells and door openings. After holding up to the rear mold to verify things are lining up, it's taken to the bandsaw. The body pinches in right around the door opening. Instead of building this up and sanding back, I calculated the angle and cut a piece on my table saw. The molds need to have all the sides filled in, right down to the vacuum table. If not, the plastic will pull in to a point of failure. I just added some MDF to the bottom before sanding this all flat on the benchtop sander. The side panels are vacuum formed and then cut out in preparation for gluing to the rear section. The side panel came out a little thin. This is mostly due to the height of the mold, and the material needs to stretch a further distance. It tends to thin out. Instead of making another one with thicker plastic, I just glued in panels to thicken this back up. The end result is the same, and this way I don't have to waste an entire sheet of plastic. This stage of gluing the panels together is very critical. Not having a lot of reference points to measure against, it's easy to get these out of alignment or out of square. One trick is to place two pieces on a flat surface, like the bench, and then hold them in place with clamps. Small precision squares and 1, 2, 3 blocks can be used to verify things are in alignment and square. The bottom piece, which makes up the floor, is another piece to pay special attention. Since this will act as an alignment tool for the side panels, it needs to be carefully marked out and cut. A small angle is placed toward the front, where the piece turns up under the driver. After I am satisfied with the pieces, they are solvent glued in place. To help with vertical alignment, small pieces of styrene are glued to the side panels. These act as kind of a shelf, as well as additional support for the joint. The more surface area you can get for the joint, the stronger it will be. I'm not sure if I got the fuel tank cut out exactly correct in the floor, but it's pretty close. Sometimes it's hard to find good detailed pictures for these smaller details. This lowered section holds the fuel tank, but once in place, aligns the seat base at the same height as the passenger. The next molds to make are for the inner fender wells. To save on wood, I make a box with the MDF versus just gluing them all together into one solid shape. These shapes are then cut and sanded back to match the drawing. The fenders have stamped portions, which I make by adding thin strips of styrene. Since I had issues with the side panels getting thin, I wanted to avoid this on the fender molds. The section that butts up against the side panel really doesn't need to be there. In order to get the mold a little closer to the vacuum table, this portion is sanded away. It's easier to make the piece as it should be, and once happy with the fitment, sand it back. The hood is made from another glue-up of MDF. There's a slight taper to the hood, and it has a slight crown. But other than that, it's a pretty simple piece to make. A matching mold is made to match up with the rear of the hood and to make the section where the dash will later be mounted. All the imperfections were filled in with the glaze filler and sanded back. I didn't always pay this close attention to the molds. However, I've found that a little bit of extra effort in the beginning can make the panels a lot easier to finish once they are vacuum formed. As you can see, angling down the fenders got me a very nice piece to work with. The hood and cowl are glued together first. I use these small clamps a lot, and they have a very surprising amount of clamping force. One thing I have to pay close attention to when solvent gluing is stress points in the styrene. These can be caused by cold bending the pieces, or if there's just a lot of pressure being put in from the clamps. The solvent glue will seek out these stress points and cause the part to fail. I found that the stress points are generally stable as long as you don't flood them with the solvent. If I suspect this, I just need to pre-soak each piece, allow them dry a bit before the assembly. The fenders get a little sanding and fitment before they are also glued into place. Cutting the holes out for the fenders ahead of time makes it easier for glue up, but it's stressful since a shift in the wrong direction can cause a gap that needs to be patched. I was lucky here, this was not a problem. Another piece which needs to be vacuum formed is the tailgate. It's just a block of MDF with a bunch of styrene shapes glued on. Not all the small details are added, since more will need to be glued on after it is removed from the mold. If I ever make another one of these, I will make sure to remove the portion between the fenders where the tailgate goes. I thought I would leave it in place and just apply the vacuum form piece on top. However, once in place, I really didn't like the look. This caused me to have to remove that piece after the tailgate was already installed. It wasn't a problem in the end, but it was pretty difficult. A simple shape for the shifters was scratch built and glued into place. I took a lot of time to mold pieces in Fusion 360 that I would 3D print. One of these is the fuel filler. The Willys Jeeps have different fuel tanks as the truck transitions from the military vehicle to the civilian use. The early ones relied on a filler under the seat. This model has a fuel filler plumb to the outside of the vehicle. Here I am cutting an opening so the 3D printed fuel filler can be glued into place. The fuel filler was designed with a long spout that would be trimmed back. This spout is sent into the 3D printed fuel tank. I printed this hollow to save on resin, weight, and due to the fact that it was not a structural piece. I just needed to line up the fuel filler and cut a hole in the side of the tank. It was big enough so the tank can be removed to allow for painting later on. The shifter assembly was mounted with screws, but in the end, CA glue was used instead. The dash is just a simple piece of styrene. Once it's cut to shape, it gets glued onto the cowl. All the detail of the dash comes from 3D printed pieces that are added to it. Like the fenders, the bed has raised portions. I simply cut strips and glued them down. It took a few minutes doing some simple math before I laid out the pattern directly on the floor. Once in place, it's just a process of cutting and gluing down the strips. As mentioned, the dash gets its detail from the glued on pieces. When I make these, tabs are added to the back. Once you drill a matching size hole, it offers a positive key for placing these pieces on. This allows for careful measurements to be made before any final color is added. Once you get the parts painted, the 3D printed pieces slide back in the holes and are very easy to glue in place. The tabs also add a little bit of extra mechanical connection. This model Jeep has a dash-mounted handbrake. A 3D printed insert was made and a corresponding hole was cut. I just need to fill in and smooth around the transition. The windshield is going to be hinged to fold flat against the hood. On the real Jeep, latches are used to hold the windshield in place to the dash. I recreated these latches in Fusion 360, but printed them separately. One piece will be attached to the windshield and the other to the dash. When it's put up, they look like they're latch, but will separate when they're folded down. The tailgate has a lot of detail embedded in the mold, but some of it's best left for scratch building afterwards. I'm adding in thin strips down the side to represent the transition between the body and the tailgate. I also glued in some 3D printed hinges at the bottom. Later on, chains will be added, but this is good for now. The scariest part of this build is the grille. It's not because it's harder than other parts, but because it's so iconic. If this part is off, it will be obvious to everyone. To make the mold, a cutout of the drawing was used to mark up the styrene. Holes were drilled at each end, and the holes were then connected using a razor blade. This part gets glued to an MDF board, which will add structure and depth for the vacuum forming process. The portion between the slats is removed and some styrene shapes were glued to the back of each slat. This adds rigidity as well as some needed depth. It also gives a good edge to fill and sand back to. The holes for the headlights were ground to size and a 3D printed ring was glued in place. This piece was designed to hold an RC four-wheel drive Mojave headlight lens. On the back side of the light, an aluminum funnel is glued in place to form a reflector. After cutting off the end of the funnel and drilling a 5mm hole, an LED can be inserted. The grill gets glued in place and backed with CA glue. Later on, I end up modifying the grill by cutting a section out and lowering the point down at the center of the hood. I also modified the mold so any new pieces will come out right the first time. I was really wanting to get the fenders and inner fender structure complete, but had to wait until the hood and grill were in place. These pieces turned out pretty easy to make since they were not a lot of shaping. I just needed to cut pieces on my table saw and glue them together. Each side gets vacuum formed and then glued into place. The only part left are the flat fenders. These were built the same way as the inner fenders by using angled pieces from my table saw. So the last thing to build is the windshield. I am using stainless steel capillary tubing. Different benders along with the vise and a hammer were used to shape these pieces. These tubes were not long enough to make the whole entire thing out of one piece. Besides, it would have been a lot harder to get both sides to match. A block of wood was cut to be the same width of the Jeep. The lower section was screwed into place and they were brazed together. I use this block to keep adding in sections of tubing. This keeps the part accurate while reducing the chance of melting the body. The same tubing was used to make the seat structure. One is attached over the fuel cell and the other on the passenger floor. As before, the pieces were brazed together while being attached to the wooden block. To finish off the body build, 3D printed taillights were screwed into place. This wraps up the major construction of this build. There is much more to go on this, well that will have to wait till next time. Until then, I'll see you on the rocks.
Yeah.